Today we're going to do a quick study of a magnolia, and for some of this I'll speed it up. I'll talk you through the techniques that I would use in the early stages, and then I will speed the video up to get the flower finished, because otherwise it becomes a bit monotonous. So my first step, if I want a fairly detailed, realistic flower that would match the leaf that we've done in the tutorials as well, I would wet the paper, and this is called priming, so the paint will actually absorb better into the paper, and it allows us to do a little bit more work in the leaf. In this first wash, it gives us more time to build up layers of colour and adjust detail, but it also, because it absorbs, it means we can work over the top of it without moving that first layer of paint. So I've just got a variety of pinks out, some Rose Madder Genuine, a little bit of magenta, basically any cool pinks you can use a mix of. One colour I do like with a flower for in some of the deep parts is Pyrolene Maroon. I don't have that out, I'm not using it today, just because I forgot to get up and get it before I started. And so I'm coming in at times with soft watery pigment and at other times with thicker pigment and a drier brush, because I want to get fairly rich colour in this early stage of the flower. I've actually got a little touch of Ochre Rose out as well, which I just popped in that then to brighten the colour a little bit. And so I'll put a suggestion of pinks where I want the colour. And then I'll come back and clean my brush. You could hear I'm actually touching the bottom of the water well, not just splashing it in the top. I want to actually get all of the pigment out of the brush. And now I'm dropping a little bit of a mauve, which is a mix of Cobalt Blue and Rose Madder Genuine, because the white that I can see on this petal is actually, there's not much that is actual white. So again, I'm cleaning my brush, taking the excess moisture out on paper towel that's beside me, and now I'm going to come back with this clean, nearly dry brush, and I can just adjust the colours and get a little bit of this sense of the stroking, the direction that the pigment has. There's a sense of veins on magnolias sometimes. You have to be careful that your edges are lovely and smooth, particularly if you're using a rougher paper. You've got to just push the pigment down into the shape, because that's what gives our flower clearly the look of which petals sit behind which, if we've got that nicely defined. So there's actually a shadow across this part of the petal, so I will come in with a slightly darker mix of that mauve, and perhaps even a bit more pink in that. I'm going into the colour I think was called Red Violet. That's not one from my usual palette. I'm playing with colours that I bought in a different range to what I usually use, because they've been sitting in the box ever since I bought them. So now I'm just manipulating so that the colour has the edges that I want, whether it's a soft edge or a bit of this line work coming out. And if I put it down like I did then and the paper's nearly dry and it has a harder look than what I'm trying to achieve, I'll clean my brush, dry it off in my fingers, between my fingers like this. And you can see how much moisture there still is in the brush. And then come back and just soften that edge. And now I'll let that dry, and I can come back later and add a little bit more detail if I want to. Just want to get one more stroke there. And now I have to pick a petal to work on that is not touching anything that's wet. So I can come across to this one, either of these two, the underside here or this one over here. And again, I'll wet that petal. Making sure it's even. So there's many different ways to paint flowers, and this technique that I'm using now is to get it a little bit more botanical, a little bit more detailed. And I've got some other tutorials that are painting looser. Now you might be able to see I've got a big chunk of Ochre rose on my brush, so I'm just going to avoid turning that over at the moment. I want a little bit more mauve mixed into where I can see shadow. And then I'm going to clean my brush and come back and just smooth through, similar to what we did in the first petal. You can also define, before it dries, define some suggestion of veining just with the end of a brush. We don't want to overdo this, but the magnolia does have some lovely fine. I'm trying to clean the pigment off. I should have cleaned that off before I did the second stroke. The magnolia does have some lovely fine veining, almost like a leaf, so this technique will make the pigment sink into the divot that we create. But I try not to overdo that. You might just do it, you might not do it on every petal, you might just do it in a couple of spots. And I'm not putting on shadows at this stage that have hard edges. So up here, these little shadows that are cast by the sun, by something that's between the sun and the object. So this petal has a little lip here that's curving that creates this cast shadow on the back side. So anything that has a hard edge as a shadow, I'm not doing yet. I can see a lovely sort of bright bit here, so I'm just dropping in a little touch of brighter pink there, and I've just got to be careful that my brush is drier than the paper when I go back in to add to it. So I'm going to stop talking and speed up the video now so that you can just see the process as I do it without it being too slow and monotonous. That petal, you might notice I didn't wet first. It's the inside of the magnolia is often actually white or light, so it has a very soft look to the colour. And at the edge here we're seeing a little bit of a turn back that shows us the outer edge of the petal, so that colour is stronger. So I didn't wet the petal because I wanted a few harder edges to those colours and that shape. Now I'm adding some ultramarine blue and brown matter to darken. And I realised I've actually got my highlight on the wrong side in relation to the shadow pattern on the flower. My photo was taken in portrait mode, so it actually blurred out the stem. I'm just dropping a little bit of darker colour along one side to give it a little bit more roundness. This petal has a little turn back along here, so I treat that as a totally separate petal because I want to keep it light, so I don't wet it in this initial wash. So this petal under here mainly just has a cast shadow on it, which has a firm shape. So instead of, or definitive shape, sorry, not a firm shape. So instead of wetting the whole petal, I'm just going to wet the shape that is the shadow. And I'm going to drop the colour just into that area. Usually I leave the cast shadows until right at the end because I paint them over the top of the local colour. So when I say local colour, I mean the colour that the petal is if it didn't have the shadow on it. But this petal doesn't have much at all because what's peeping out is basically white. So I am going to just wet that shape. And drop my mauvey shadow colour onto it so it's paler mauve out here and then it becomes pinker closer to the inner, which is because of two reasons. There might be some local colour, some local pink there actually on the petal, like it starts out pink and becomes white, but it also can be due to reflected light because this petal is quite bright and pink on the inside. So I've added more pink into my shadow colour. I need for it to have a fairly mauvey tone though, for it to read like shadow, not just to read like the petal colour. If I did the same kind of pink as here, it would just look like petal colour. So I'm adding more mauve. If I had Pyrolene maroon out in my palette, that would be good in the really deep darks, but I've got a colour called red violet here that I'm testing, so it will give me a similar result. And there's a definitive line there where the pink goes to and then it becomes more purple, so I'm going to try and just keep the pink to here, but I can make that more of a line in a second wash of colour. In my shadow areas though, if you've seen me paint boats or anything else, you'll see I very rarely will just put a mauve down and leave it as is. When I look at this photo, in this petal I see a yellow tone as well, and that yellow tone makes my shadows glow. So I'm just dropping it in on top. I'm careful not to push it in and mix it a lot because that would actually make a grey. If I just drop the mauve very gently on top of the purple, I'm almost pushing the purple away with the mauve. It will make the shadow glow rather than forming a grey. And I'm just going in with thicker pigment right down in close to get that dark. Thicker pigment because I want a little bit more control of how far it spreads. And I feel like I made that too pink. There's not much light on that at all, so I might just pick up a little bit of that colour with my clean, nearly dry brush. This is what I refer to as a thirsty brush. It's going to suck the pigment up into the brush rather than put moisture down. And because it's quite wet, that will keep running back in, and I'll just keep an eye on it, lift it out again if I need to. So now I'm ready to drop some shadows on, and it's really important to put those shadows in nice and strongly so that they give the flower the shape and form that it needs. So usually I'll dampen just that shape that I can see the shadow forming. Now these two touch. Oh, but the shadow doesn't touch, so that's lucky that I just noticed in time. Sometimes if it's a skinny little bit of shadow like these two bits up the side, I won't worry about pre-wetting it, and I would just drag the colour up. So I added some stronger pink in some parts of it, but I also want to still see that yellow glow through, so I'll actually re-establish that by putting the yellow ochre or Naples yellow back in that area. And then some parts of this petal in particular has you know, little sort of ripply shadows. So this is where you can add some extra detail into the petal so that it doesn't look just smooth and boring. There's a few that sort of come off. They come off this side a little bit and across. This one as well. This is a smaller shape and thinner, so I'm just going to put it straight on without dampening the shape. Excuse my throat noises. And I can see some lovely yellow happening up in this shadow as well, so I will put the colour down. This is just clean water at the moment, just to soften. And now the yellow ochre. Some shadows in your photo might not translate very well to painting. Like this one in the back here is the one I'm doing. I just don't have enough space here, I don't think, to get that real curve that it's creating. So what I'm going to do is just push that back a little bit with clean water. I feel like I brought it too far. And then when that's nearly dry, I'll just reform that shape. And I just lost the little light that I was trying to keep through the center. This, excuse me, the main petal here doesn't have much actual shadow on it. But there's a little bit of defined shadow just in through this section. That is what creates the curve over. And a little bit down here. So I'm just going darker because this was already a strong pigment. And then sometimes this can look a little bit too smooth. So this is where I might come down with, there's next to nothing on my brush, just a little, I do have to put a little bit more than what I had. But it's just creating a little bit more rippling and texture in the leaf. Otherwise it just feels a bit too bland. So I'm cleaning my brush and I'll just soften if needed in a couple of areas. I want to just keep that texture. These look too blobby, so I'm just going to, with clean water, soften through so that I didn't look like I had 3 fingers. part of the decision of if I'm wetting the shadow shape or not wetting it. And that was just forming that shadow a little bit more. Remember, it has that definite line. Now I'm just actually making it a little touch bluer. And when that's nearly dry, I'm just going to catch that with my nearly dry brush to just soften the line a little bit, so it does look like it's in the shadow, but just creating the curve of the petal. I notice I've got a couple of lines here where my shadow doesn't go right to the edge of my petal, and that's a bit of a problem, so I'll just, with thicker pigment on my brush, touch that right to there. And the other thing I feel like is this shape is not very nice. I don't like kind of how strong this striping is, so I'm just going to soften that with clean water. The petal is still damp. I might get a little bloom or a cauliflower, but that's fine. That looks better now. Oh, and I was going to come back to this part and I forgot, so I'll just soften that again. And so that's, you know, pretty much finished for a quick demo. I could keep working on this for half an hour or an hour longer, deepening some parts of those shadows, softening some other edges. This is the perfect timing for that softening of that line. But with priming on good paper, that shouldn't have lifted the first wash like it did a little bit there. You'll see there's a slight white line where I just was softening that. If this was no really good Arches paper, that wouldn't have lifted the first wash.